Listen carefully, because this is not one of those videos you casually watch and forget. I'm talking to you, not at you. Most people don't realize when they're hurting a super empath because the damage doesn't show up loudly. It happens quietly, slowly, in ways that feel harmless at first. And by the time you notice the distance, the silence, the emotional shift, it's already too late to fix it. I've seen this pattern again and again, and thinkers like Carl Jung warned us about this exact kind of unconscious destruction. What you ignore in a person doesn't disappear, it transforms. In this video, I'm not here to accuse you, shame you, or scare you. I'm here to make you aware, because awareness is the last door before regret. Stay with me till the end, because one of these points might hit closer than you expect. And if at any moment you feel like I'm speaking your story, don't just scroll, drop a comment, even one word, and subscribe, not because it helps me, but because these conversations change how you see people and yourself. When I talk about the moment a super empath withdraws, I want you to understand something very clearly. This moment is never sudden, even though it looks that way from the outside. What you see as detachment is actually the final stage of a long, exhausting inner journey. A super empath does not leave when they are angry, confused, or emotional. They leave when they are clear. Before that clarity arrives, there are countless moments where they question themselves instead of you. They replay conversations in their mind, justify your behavior, and search for reasons to stay emotionally present even when it hurts. They don't walk away easily because their nature is to understand, to feel deeply, and to hold space for others. Every time they feel dismissed, unvalued, or emotionally neglected, they don't react loudly, they absorb it quietly. And that absorption creates an internal conflict that grows over time. This is where the real damage happens, long before any visible distance appears. I've learned that what truly breaks the bond is not one big betrayal, but a series of small moments where emotional needs are ignored. A super empath notices tone shifts, unspoken tension, emotional absence, and subtle disrespect. They feel when their care is taken for granted. At first, they try harder, they communicate more gently, they give more chances than they should. But inside, something begins to change. As Carl Jung explained, what is ignored in the psyche does not disappear, it transforms. When their emotional pain is repeatedly overlooked, it doesn't vanish, it turns inward. It becomes self-doubt, emotional fatigue, and eventually acceptance that their efforts are no longer being met with the same depth. By the time a super empath starts pulling away, they have already grieved the connection in silence. This is the part most people never see. The mourning happens internally while they are still physically present. They laugh, talk, and show up, but something sacred has already begun to fade. They are slowly letting go of the version of you they believed in, the version they kept hoping would show up emotionally. Each unmet expectation is processed privately. Each disappointment is quietly released. So when they finally withdraw, they are not acting out of impulse. They are acting from emotional closure. What makes this moment so painful for others is that it feels abrupt. One day the empath is warm, present, and deeply invested. Then suddenly they're distant, calm, and unreachable. But this calm is not coldness, it's resolution. A super empath does not detach until their heart has accepted that continuing to stay would mean betraying themselves. And once that realization settles in, the bond you thought still existed is already gone. Not because they stopped caring,
but because caring without reciprocity became too heavy to carry. Another truth that's hard to face is that a super empath always gives warnings, but not in obvious ways. Their warnings come as emotional honesty, vulnerability, and patience. They express hurt softly. They explain how something made them feel instead of blaming. When those signals are ignored or minimized, they slowly stop speaking, not because they have nothing to say, but because they've realized they're not being heard. Silence, in this case, is not emotional withdrawal, it's emotional self-preservation. By the time distance becomes visible, the emotional connection has already been internally mourned. This is why trying to fix things after that point often fails. You're attempting to revive something that has already been laid to rest in their inner world. A super empath doesn't close doors out of pride or revenge. They close them because leaving them open became emotionally unsafe. Once they detach, they don't look back the same way. The love they once poured outward has been redirected inward toward healing and self-respect. This is why the moment a super empath withdraws is so final. Not because they lack compassion, but because they've learned where their compassion belongs. The bond isn't lost in the silence. It was lost in all the moments when emotional depth was offered and not received. And that loss doesn't announce itself loudly. It happens quietly, patiently, and completely.
When people say they broke a super empath, they misunderstand what actually happened. You don't break a super empath. What you really do, through repeated emotional harm, is awaken a part of them they were never forced to use before, their shadow. At first, a super empath leads with light. They are patient, forgiving, emotionally open, and willing to see the good even when it costs them something. They give understanding where others would draw lines. But when emotional harm becomes a pattern instead of a mistake, something inside them begins to shift. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but deeply. Each ignored boundary, each dismissed feeling, each repeated wound sends a quiet message to their psyche. Kindness alone is no longer safe. This is where the shadow begins to emerge. As Carl Jung explained, the shadow is not evil. It is the part of us formed by what we suppress, deny, or are forced to develop for survival. For a super empath, the shadow is born when their compassion is repeatedly taken advantage of. They start realizing that endless understanding without protection becomes self-abandonment. This realization is painful because it goes against their nature. They don't want to become guarded. They don't want to say no. They don't want to disappoint or distance themselves. But pain has a way of teaching lessons that comfort never could. At first, the empath resists this inner change. They may feel guilt for becoming less available, less forgiving, less emotionally open. They question themselves more than they question those hurting them. But the psyche cannot ignore reality forever. When boundaries are violated too often, the shadow steps in, not to destroy love, but to protect dignity. This is the moment when the empath stops explaining their pain repeatedly. They stop offering unlimited access to their emotions. They stop hoping that being kinder will finally make someone treat them better. What's important to understand is that this transformation does not make the empath cruel. It makes them discerning. Their empathy doesn't disappear. It becomes selective. They no longer pour their emotional energy into places where it is drained without care. They begin to recognize patterns instead of excuses. The shadow gives them clarity. It allows them to see manipulation, emotional neglect, and imbalance for what they truly are. And once they see it, they cannot unsee it.
This is often the point where others feel confused. They say the empath has changed. They feel shut out. They wonder why the same behaviors that were once tolerated are no longer accepted. What they don't realize is that the empath didn't become harder. They became whole. They integrated their shadow. They learned that love without boundaries is not love, it is self-erasure. And integration is irreversible. Once a super empath learns how to protect their emotional space, they do not return to who they were before the lessons. The shadow also brings emotional strength. A super empath who has integrated their shadow no longer fears being alone more than being disrespected. They no longer cling to connections that require them to shrink. They don't need to prove their worth through endurance. This doesn't mean they stop caring. It means they stop sacrificing themselves to prove they care. The pain that once wounded them now informs them. It teaches them where to draw the line, when to walk away, and who deserves access to their inner world. This is why trying to hurt a super empath often backfires. The very actions meant to control, neglect, or diminish them become the catalyst for their evolution. Once their shadow is awakened and integrated, they are no longer easy to manipulate emotionally. They no longer respond to guilt the same way. They no longer tolerate inconsistency masked as affection. And this new version of them is calm, grounded, and firm, not aggressive, not bitter, just clear. In the end, the most powerful consequence of hurting a super empath is not their collapse, but their awakening. You don't destroy their heart, you teach it discernment. You don't erase their empathy, you refine it. And once that shadow becomes part of who they are, they stop tolerating what once wounded them, not out of revenge, but out of self-respect.
When a super empath goes silent, most people misunderstand what that silence truly means. They assume it's indifference, emotional shutdown, or even punishment. But silence, in this case, is not weakness, it is psychological closure. A super empath does not become quiet because they have nothing left to say. They become quiet because they have already said everything that mattered, often many times, in many gentle ways. Their silence arrives only after their words, feelings, and emotional truths have gone unheard for too long. Before this stage, they tried communication. They explained how they felt without blaming. They softened their pain to avoid conflict. They chose patience over confrontation. And every time they did that, they hoped it would finally lead to understanding. What most people don't see is that a super empath speaks emotionally long before they ever stop speaking verbally. They express through tone, energy, presence, and vulnerability. So when they fall silent, it means something significant has already ended inside them. The empath's silence is not emotional absence, it is emotional completion. As Carl Jung suggested in his work on the psyche, when an inner truth is repeatedly denied expression, the psyche resolves the conflict by withdrawing energy from the source of pain. In simple words, the soul stops investing where it feels invisible. This is why the silence of a super empath feels so final. It doesn't come with drama, threats, or emotional outbursts. It comes with calm. A calm that feels unsettling to those who are used to their emotional availability. That calm is clarity. By the time silence appears, the empath has already processed the grief, disappointment, and loss privately. They have accepted that being understood is no longer possible in that space. And once that acceptance settles in, there is nothing left to argue about, explain, or fix.
Many people believe silence means there is still room to return, to negotiate, to reopen conversations later. But for a super empath, silence is the result of inner resolution. It means they have stopped hoping for emotional reciprocity. They are no longer waiting for apologies to feel better. They are no longer trying to be seen. This is not coldness, it is self-respect finally taking the lead. They have learned that continuing to explain themselves only deepens the wound when the other side is not truly listening. At this stage, reconciliation becomes unlikely, not because of anger, but because of clarity. Anger still wants engagement. Silence does not. A super empath who is silent has already made peace with the outcome. They understand the pattern. They see the emotional imbalance clearly, and clarity removes the need for emotional reactions. They no longer feel the urge to defend their feelings or justify their boundaries. The silence simply says, "I see now." What makes this silence so misunderstood is that it lacks obvious emotion. People expect pain to look loud, but emotional maturity looks quiet. The empath has learned that not every truth needs to be spoken again, especially to those who had many chances to hear it. Their silence is not meant to hurt anyone. It is meant to protect themselves. It is the moment they stop pouring energy into emotional conversations that lead nowhere. This is also why trying to reconnect after this silence often feels impossible. The person reaching out is speaking to someone who has already moved on internally. The empath may still be polite, respectful, even kind, but the emotional door is closed. Not slammed, closed gently, firmly, and intentionally. Once a super empath reaches this point, reopening that door would mean returning to a version of themselves that tolerated emotional neglect, and they are no longer willing to do that. Silence for a super empath is not about power or control. It is about closure without cruelty. It is choosing peace over endless emotional labor. It is the soul acknowledging that being unheard for too long changes you. And once that change happens, the need to be understood by the same source disappears. That is why their silence feels so absolute, because it is not the beginning of distance, it is the end of attachment.
When a super empath leaves, the regret rarely comes immediately. At first, there is relief, space, even a sense of emotional quiet. But over time, something far more uncomfortable begins to surface, an emptiness that doesn't have a clear cause. This is because super empaths don't just connect with people, they amplify them. They reflect emotions, strengths, potential, and even unhealed parts back to those around them. Being close to a super empath often makes people feel more understood, more important, more alive. And when that presence disappears, what's left behind feels strangely hollow. It's not just that the person is gone, it's that the version of yourself you felt around them is gone too. Many people don't realize how much of their emotional validation came from the empath's attention, care, and belief in them. Super empaths listen deeply. They see beyond surface behavior and respond to what lies underneath. Over time, others unconsciously rely on that reflection. They feel confident because someone else sees their worth. They feel emotionally grounded because someone else is holding space for them. This is where regret eventually begins, not at the loss of the empath, but at the loss of what the empath provided without being asked. Carl Jung described this phenomenon as the loss of projection. According to Carl Jung, projection happens when we place undeveloped parts of ourselves, like emotional depth, self-worth, or compassion, onto another person. A super empath becomes a mirror for those qualities. Instead of cultivating them internally, people experience them through the empath. As long as the empath is present, this imbalance goes unnoticed.
But when they leave, the mirror is gone, and suddenly people are forced to face what was never truly theirs to begin with. This realization is deeply unsettling. The warmth that once surrounded them fades. The emotional energy that made conversations feel alive is missing. And often, people don't understand why everything feels dull, heavy, or disconnected. They mistake it for missing the person, when in reality, they are missing the emotional reflection they depended on. The empath's light no longer reflects them, and without it, they are left with parts of themselves they never learned to nurture. What makes this regret even heavier is that it usually comes too late. By the time someone recognizes the value of that emotional presence, the empath has already withdrawn fully. They have reclaimed their energy. They are no longer available to act as a mirror for someone else's growth. And because super empaths leave quietly, without drama or revenge, the absence feels permanent. There is no obvious conflict to resolve, no argument to reopen, just a silent gap where warmth used to be. This is why people often replay memories after a super empath leaves. They remember the encouragement, the patience, the way they were believed in during moments of self-doubt. And with that reflection comes regret, not just for losing the empath, but for not recognizing the imbalance while it was happening, for taking emotional support for granted, for assuming that light would always be there. The hardest part is realizing that what was lost cannot be replaced by another person in the same way. A super empath's reflection is unique because it comes from genuine emotional presence, not performance. Once that light is gone, the only way forward is inward, and that inward journey is often the one people avoided while the empath was doing the emotional work for them. In the end, the regret doesn't come from abandonment, it comes from awareness. Awareness that someone once reflected the best parts of you, believed in them, amplified them, and you didn't learn to hold those parts yourself. By the time that truth becomes clear, the mirror is already gone, and the lesson, though painful, is unavoidable. No one else can permanently carry the light you were meant to grow on your own.
When a super empath truly heals, something irreversible happens. They don't become distant, cold, or unreachable in a dramatic way. They become untouchable, not because they lack emotion, but because they finally understand where their emotions belong. Healing doesn't close their heart, it refines it. It changes how they perceive connection, effort, and love itself. What once felt familiar and comforting is now seen with clarity. Patterns that were once excused are now recognized as imbalance, and this shift is quiet but permanent. Before healing, a super empath often confuses intensity with love. They stay in situations that demand emotional sacrifice because they believe endurance is proof of care. They tolerate inconsistency, emotional neglect, and unspoken pain because they hope understanding will eventually be returned. But healing changes that internal logic. It teaches them that love does not require constant self-abandonment. Growth rewires perception. What once felt like devotion now feels draining. What once felt normal now feels misaligned. And once this awareness settles in, they cannot go back to seeing the connection the same way. Carl Jung spoke about individuation, the process of becoming whole by integrating all parts of the self. As Carl Jung emphasized, growth brings consciousness, and consciousness dissolves illusions. For a healed super empath, this means recognizing where they overgave, where they accepted less, and where they mistook emotional labor for intimacy. This awareness doesn't come with bitterness, it comes with peace, and peace is what makes them untouchable.
Being untouchable does not mean being inaccessible to healthy connection. It means they are no longer available for dynamics that rely on imbalance. They don't engage in emotional push and pull. They don't chase clarity. They don't wait to be chosen. Their boundaries are calm, firm, and non-negotiable. This often confuses people who knew them before healing. They expect the same patience, the same availability, the same emotional forgiveness, but that version of the empath no longer exists, not because they were lost, but because they evolved. This is where the real tragedy lies. The tragedy is not that the empath changed. Change was necessary for their survival and self-respect. The tragedy is that the opportunity to treat them better expired quietly. There was no final argument, no dramatic ending, no warning announcement. The chance was present in every ignored feeling, every delayed apology, every moment emotional effort was taken for granted. And while others assumed time would always be available, the empath was healing. Once healed, they don't return to familiar pain out of nostalgia. They understand that familiarity is not safety. They no longer romanticize struggle. They no longer believe that love must be proven through suffering. And because of this, they don't re-enter old dynamics to try again. They recognize that trying again would mean unlearning what healing taught them. This is why reconnecting with a healed super empath feels impossible. Not because they hold resentment, but because they hold clarity. They are polite, kind, and emotionally grounded, but the depth they once offered freely is now reserved. Access is earned through consistency, respect, and emotional maturity. They no longer overextend themselves to make others comfortable. Their peace has become more valuable than being understood by those who once misunderstood them. In the end, healing doesn't harden a super empath, it liberates them. It allows them to love without losing themselves and to walk away without guilt. And when people realize what they lost, they often label it as distance or coldness. But the truth is simpler and more uncomfortable. The empath didn't become unreachable, they became whole. And the moment to meet them at that level passed long before anyone noticed.